Hello everyone. The first chapter of this term that we are going to talk about is acid and base chemistry. Yep, that's right. It's all about the base and acid. You're right. But why do we care then? Acid and base are very important chemistry that can find in so many fields. For example, in agriculture, controlling pH of the soil, or in food fermentation, right, control pH of the brewery process, or even in sports science, right? The acid condition of the body or basic condition of the body that can cause many symptoms. So that's why today we are going to learn about chemistry of the acid and base. Now let's take a look at the overview of this chapter real quick. There are 8 chapter sections within these. We are going to jump into chapter 14.1 and then followed by 14.2 and so on. And you should use this overview for each chapter to help guide you study. The chapter overview will also help you as well to see what are the learning outcomes and what are the skills that you need to obtain for these chapters. Now, before we get into the chemistry of acid-base, let's take a look at the definition of acid-base first. You can find this in chapter 14.1. Please read the reading assignment on the OER textbook for this for more detail. Bronsted-Lowry has defined the acid-base by the fact that Bronsted acid are the substance that can donate hydrogen ions or proton to another species. If you think about this from what we learned in Chem 121, you will see that the reason why we call this proton is because hydrogen atom contain only one electron. Once it's losing that one electron, it's become positive and it's contain only proton in the nucleus. That's why we call this species proton. And Bronsted-Lowry define bases are substances that accept this proton from another species. Now let's take a look at an example between water and ammonia molecule. When water and ammonia react, it gives off hydroxide ion and ammonium ion. In this example, you can see that water behaves as an acid because it's losing one proton, and ammonia behaves as a base because it's gaining proton to become an ammonium ion. Water losing a proton become hydroxide ion. We call hydroxide ion is a conjugate base of water. And again, because ammonia behave as a base and gain a proton from water, it's become ammonium ion. We call ammonium ion conjugate acid. Thus, the conjugate acid-base pair are the species that differ by one proton. For example, water and hydroxide ions are conjugate acid-base pair. And ammonia and ammonium ion are conjugate acid-base pair as well. Note that conjugate base will have one less proton than its conjugate acid. Vice versa, the conjugate acid will have one more proton than its conjugate base. When acid dissolves in water, it will dissociate. We call this process acid ionization. Now let's take a look at the equation that represents the acid ionization in water of the nitric acid and water. The name of nitric acid implies that nitric acid will behave as an acid. That means that the other species, water, will behave as a base. Again, according to Bronsted-Lowry definition, acid would donate proton to the base. So that means nitric acid will lose a proton, and on the other hand, water will gain a proton. You can see that as nitric acid gives a proton to water, it's become nitrate ion. And as water accepts a proton from nitric acid, it becomes hydronium ion. Again, this species is called hydronium ion. Please note that hydronium ion will be used interchangeable with proton. The reason for that is because hydronium ion is derived from a proton, but it just in the water. And since we are talking about the solution that is in water, so that's why most of the time the proton will present as a hydronium ion. The Lewis structure of hydronium ions can be drawn as the following. We will start with water molecule. And as this water molecule accepts a proton, which is this proton here, is going to create a covalent bond with another proton, making it to be a hydronium ion with one positive charge. Remember, because water has two lone pairs, one of the lone pairs already used to covalent bonded to proton, so that means we will have the only one lone pair left. So this would be the Lewis structure of hydronium ion. Again, the nitrate ion will be a conjugate base of nitric acid, because as nitric acid lose a proton, it's become nitrate ion. And at the same time, conjugate acid of water would be hydronium ions because it's gained one more proton. Next, let's take a look at base ionization reaction in water. So the example that I'm going to use today is we are going to use carbonate ion in water. In this case, carbonate will behave as a base and water will behave as an acid. And again, the base will accept a proton from an acid. So that's why when carbonate ion accept one proton, it's become bicarbonate or hydrogen carbonate. At the same time, because water in this case behaves as an acid, and acid give off a proton, then water will become hydroxide ions in this case. And again, conjugate acid-base pair will be different by just one proton. So the base carbonate has its conjugate acid as bicarbonate. Water and hydroxide are conjugate acid-base pair. Water is an acid in this case, and hydroxide ion is its conjugate base. When you consider both example 1 and 2, you can make a general summary as that acid would eventually give off hydronium ions in water, and a base would give off hydroxide ion in water. And conjugate acid-base pair will be different by just one proton. Conjugate acid would have one more proton than its conjugate base or its base. Vice versa, an acid would have one more proton than its conjugate base. So that means no matter what, whether you are using the word conjugate or not, the acid always going to have one more proton than a base. Next, we are going to take a look at amphoteric substance. Amphoteric substance is a species capable of either donating or accepting protons. What are the examples of amphoteric substance? This is when you will need to look at our previous example 1 and 2. If you look at example 1 and 2, you can see that in this case, water molecules in both equations can behave either donating or accepting protons. Thus, we call water as an example of amphoteric substance. Please note that acidity and basicity are relative. If something is more basic than the other species, it's going to behave itself as a base. On the other hand, if something is more acidic, it's going to behave itself as an acid over the other species. So that's why in this case, water can behave as either base or acid. It depends on what do you pair it with, right? So if you are pairing with something that is a stronger acid, then water is going to behave as a base in this case. If you are pairing it with something that's going to behave as a base, then it's going to most likely to give off proton to that species. Now let's take a look at the next example. So consider the following equation and choose the species that behave as amphoteric substance. Now let's take a look at the reaction between bicarbonate and water. As you can see, the product of this is bicarbonate and hydronium ion. You probably can already tell that in this case, bicarbonate behave as an acid because the product is carbonate ion that have one less proton. It tell me that bicarbonate is donating a proton to water, so that's why bicarbonate behave as an acid. And because water is accepting a proton from an acid, water then in this case behave as a base, and this base would have conjugate acid of a hydronium ion because gain one more proton. Now let's take a look at equation 2. Same thing here, equation 2, we start with bicarbonate and water, but the difference is that the product are not the same. The product of second reaction is that you are end up with carbonic acid and hydroxide ion. In this case, bicarbonate behave as a base because bicarbonate gain a proton from water to become carbonic acid. And at the same time, water behave as an acid because it gives off its proton to bicarbonate. And this acid would become its conjugate base, hydroxide ion. When you consider these two examples, clearly we can see that both bicarbonate and water can behave as either donating or accepting protons. So that means in this case, both bicarbonate and water are amphoteric substances. Next definition that we are going to take a look at is monoprotic and polyprotic acid. You'll probably notice the word mono, which means one, and poly means many. Protic come from the word proton. So that means mono means the substance that contains one proton, and polyprotic would be the acid that contains many protons. And exactly what I said earlier, so monoprotic acid contains only one ionizable hydrogen atom in the molecule. And diprotic acid would be an example of polyprotic acid that contains two ionizable hydrogen atoms, and same as triprotic acid as well that contains three ionizable hydrogen atoms. Now let's take a look at an example of monoprotic acid and diprotic acid. I'm going to start with monoprotic acid, hydrobromic acid first. When monoprotic acid, hydrobromic acid, is undergo acid ionization in water, this means that hydrobromic acid will react with water molecule, as we see previously, and is going to give off a proton to water to become bromide ion and hydronium ion. This would occur in just one single step because there is only one proton to ionize. However, when you consider diprotic acid or polyprotic acid, they are contain multiple hydrogen that can be ionized. So that's why the reaction for this polyprotic acid will happen in a stepwise process. The ionization of the first proton is called first ionization. The reaction can be written as carbonic acid react with water molecule, and it will give off proton to water, so it will become hydrogen carbonate or bicarbonate. And the other species would be hydronium ion as water accept a proton. We will learn about how to differentiate between one arrowhead versus the two arrowhead later when we talk about strong acid versus weak acid. Next, let's take a look at second ionization of hydrogen carbonate. So we are going to react this with water. And again, because this is going to behave as the second ionization of the acid, so that means it's going to behave as an acid by donating a proton to water, and it's going to become a carbonate ion. And the other species is hydronium ion. Again, as I mentioned earlier, all the acid would give off a proton, and at the end you are going to see the hydronium ion will be produced. Note that the difference between first ionization and the successive ionization is that the first ionization would dissociate a lot more than the successive ionization. Now let's take a look at example 5. Which of the following is polyprotic acid? Please recall from CH121. The acid are the species that have hydrogen written first, and it can be binary acid or it can be oxyacid. Next, we are going to eliminate the species that are not acid. If you consider CH4, hydrogen is not written first, so this is not an acid. NH3, hydrogen is not written first, so this is not an acid. CH3COO, again, the hydrogen is not written first, this is not an acid. Now, if you're looking at D and E, D has 2 hydrogen written first before PO. And as you see, this is matching with the oxyacid generic formula. And next, if you look at HF, you can see that hydrogen is written first, and this matching with the generic of binary acid. So that means these two considered to be an acid. Because polyprotic acid means many protons, so that means if you're looking at it, this contains more than one proton, this contains just one proton, so that means the answer for polyprotic would be D. Next, take a look at example 6. Provide stepwise ionization process of sulfuric acid. There are 2 hydrogen that this acid can donate, so that means there should be 2 stepwise ionization process for this acid. So let's start with the first stepwise ionization process. You want to start with sulfuric acid, which is in aqueous solution, react with water. And we are going to learn about this later, but sulfuric acid is one of the strong acids. So the arrowhead that is used for strong acid would be one arrowhead, and it's going to ionize into one hydrogen because give off the other to water and become hydrogen sulfate. And the other species is hydronium ion. The hydrogen sulfate then will undergo second ionization, and you can write second ionization process as hydrogen sulfate ion react with water. And because hydrogen sulfate ion is not a strong acid, so the arrow that we're going to use is going to be a reversible arrow with 2 heads, and the product from this would be sulfate ion, because hydrogen sulfate losing a proton, which is one positive charge, is going to gain one more negative, right? So it's going to become sulfate 2 minus, and the other species would be hydronium ion. As I mentioned earlier, the first ionization of polyprotic acid will always ionize more than the second process. So in this case, as sulfuric acid is strong acid, it's going to fully ionize, but the second process will be only partially ionized. Please practice more of this concept by doing the DIY problems that I provide here, and we are going to work on this together during the Hangout session as well, and the answer key for this will be provided on Moodle. Thank you for watching.